In today's video, we're making a Texas flag cutting board. The board is made of walnut, maple, and Padauk, and it also features a solid maple star insert. It's one of my favorite boards to make, and I can't wait to show you how I did it. To start off the project, I made cuts on my crosscut sled at about 18 inches. Going back, I should have probably cut them at 12 inches since the cutting board ends up not being very big. But I used Padauk, walnut, and maple to give the three distinct colors of the Texas flag. Once I made all my cuts, I took it over to the joiner and started getting one square edge so that I could take it to my table saw and start cutting it at about 1.25 inches and get them all ready for glue up. When making these cuts, just make sure that you have the riving knife on and use a push stick to push your workpiece all the way through, just to be safe. Once I had all my pieces cut, I decided to see how they were going to look and see if I had enough pieces to make the cutting board large enough. I already had this maple glued up, so it was a scrap piece from another board, and as you can see, I have my Padauk there, and my walnut is also some scraps that I had from another project. And I also have this star that I'll be adding to it to make the star in the actual flag shape. To glue up the pieces, I just used some Type-On 3 and I'll use my roller to get a good amount of glue on there, and then just put some clamps on there and let it dry. Okay, so this is that piece of maple that I had to flatten out. In order to do that, I used a planer sled with a few shims that I'm going to hot glue into place just to make sure it doesn't move when I run it through the planer. All you have to do is just add a dab of glue and then a few shims, and once it stops knocking back and forth, then you know it's pretty level, and then you can run it over to your planer and start making your passes. After I make a few passes, I can go ahead and remove it from the planer sled and flip it over and test to see if it's flat. You just put it on a flat surface and touch the edges, and if there's no knocking back and forth, then you're good to go. You can take it back to the planer and run it a few times, and it's going to be perfectly flat and ready for glue up. Now I can take the rest of the pieces and run them over to the planer to make sure I get the same thickness on all of them. And after that, I can take it to my crosscut sled again and cut them all to the correct lengths just before they're ready for glue up. I do have a video showing how I made this crosscut sled, so if you're interested, I'm going to include a link down below. With all my pieces cut to rough size, I can kind of lay them out to see how it's going to look. And I'm also going to start laying out where I'm going to put the star. I get the star from a company called Slab Stitcher. I've actually done another YouTube video on how I use this template system to add inlays to my workpieces. So here I'm using it to add this star. It's a solid maple star, but they have tons of other options if you guys want to check that out. So I'll include a link to the video and to their website so you guys can see what they have. So once the glue dried on the star, I ran it through the planer at the same height that I had before. So it's ready to go now, and all my pieces are ready to be glued together. What I'm starting to notice here is that there is a gap between the Padauk and the maple, just because the pieces are not perfectly flat. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a technique that I've done before when I'm doing either cutting boards or tabletops. And basically you make sure that you have the same edges that you want to glue up, and you run them together on your joiner. So you just mark off on the same side. I just do triangles, and then you fold them up together and run them on your joiner at the same time. Now that I had my pieces squared up, I decided to make some lines as reference marks for my domino. It only needs 2 or 3 dominoes, and the reason that I'm adding them is to make sure that the boards stay flat during glue up. I decided to do a quick test fit here just to make sure that my edges were flat and that it was going to line up nicely during glue up. Now it's time to go ahead and start gluing it together. I glued the Padauk section to the maple section and let that dry for a couple hours, and then it was time to glue the rest of it together. A really important part of the process is to make sure you use some cauls here to keep it flat while the glue dries. Now that the maple and Padauk section were glued up, I could go ahead and make some dominoes. in that section and in the walnut to glue that together as well. Follow the same process. I just put some dominoes and some glue and clamped it together. It was a pretty tight fit, so I had to use my clamps to gradually draw it together until it was ready to clamp. I had this pretty large gap on the back of the board that I decided to fill with some Starbond brown, and I just put a little bit at a time and then used the accelerator to dry it. And once it was dry, I could start sanding it. And here I used my Brotex to kind of do a rough sanding at 80 grit all over the board. And then I'm going to go back with my smaller sander, and that's when I really start my sanding process, where I start at 80 grit, then I go up to 120, and then I do a splash of water to raise the grain and let that dry. And once the grain is raised, then I can go with the finer grits. Before raising the grain, I just take my palm router here and just put a quick round over. This just makes sure that the board is comfortable in your hands and that it doesn't feel rough and you don't have any sharp edges. And right here I'm going to spray it down with some water, and you can really start to see what the board's going to look like. Right after this I let it dry, and then I hit it with the higher grits. I also make sure to sand the edges, and once my edges are sanded, I like to use a little template to throw some feet on the back of the board. I just use my template, drill in a little bit, and then finish off the starter hole. And with my other drill, I just go ahead and screw it in. I've been using this sanding net from Diablo. It works pretty well. I'm using it on pretty much all my boards. So I use that all the way up to 400. And then I use this walrus oil to finish off the boards. I put a good amount on there, and then I just rub it in. And you want to leave it for a few hours to let it kind of soak into the board. And once that's done, then I'll just wipe off the excess, and the board is finally done. I just let the board dry overnight, and as you can see, this thing looks amazing. Like I said, it's one of my favorite type of boards to build. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you're interested, I'm going to include links down to all the products that I use for my Amazon store, and you guys can check that out. I'm also going to include links to my Instagram, so you guys can check that out as well. But yeah guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope to be making more videos like this soon, so please subscribe, and I'll see you next time.